In this video, we're going to cover water and how it interacts with other molecules. Let's start by looking at the structure of a water molecule again. Notice the partial positive and partial negative charges, which are generated by these polar covalent bonds between oxygen and hydrogen. Okay, let's take a quick quiz. Which of these two molecules do you think water is more likely to be attracted to? On the left, we have a beautiful ionic compound, sodium chloride. Remember, this is two ions bound together by the attraction between positive and negative. On the right, we have a lovely hydrocarbon with beautiful nonpolar covalent bonds between each one of these atoms. What do you think? If you said the ionic compound, congratulations. Because water is charged, it's really going to love interacting with the full charges of the sodium ion and chloride ion. It will be able to react with them extremely easily. You've probably experienced this yourself if you've ever dropped sodium chloride, in other words table salt, into water. It dissolves. And if we look more closely, this is what is happening. The sodium chloride dissociates into sodium ions and chloride ions, and since each of these is charged, they interact with the partial positive and negative charges of the water molecules. Notice how the sodium ion is surrounded by partially negatively charged oxygen, and the negatively charged chloride ion is surrounded by partially positively charged hydrogens. Shall we do one more round? Same question, which do you think water is more likely to be attracted to? Is it A, cholesterol, a gorgeous steroid with a bunch of interlocking hydrocarbon rings? Or is it B, glucose, a simple sugar notable for these many hydroxyl groups, which are an oxygen and a hydrogen covalently bound? We can represent hydroxyl groups in a couple of different ways shown below. A hydroxyl group is simply an oxygen atom covalently bound to a hydrogen atom. Sometimes we just simplify them and write OH instead of writing out the covalent bond between oxygen and hydrogen. Okay, so A or B? If you said B, you are our lucky winner. Why would water be better able to interact with glucose? Well, it comes back down to electronegativity. Remember that? Our glucose molecule has several hydroxyl groups, which are composed of oxygen and hydrogen. And oxygen is a lot more electronegative, so this covalent bond between each oxygen and hydrogen is going to be polar. So we have a bunch of polar covalent bonds, which means regions of partial charge, which means that water with its own partial charges is going to be attracted to it. Cholesterol has a hydroxyl group too, which you can see at the bottom left. But there's just one of these groups and a whole ton of carbon and hydrogens, which are all held together by nonpolar covalent bonds. So overall, cholesterol is pretty darn nonpolar, and it's not going to react very well with water at all. Molecules that interact well with water, charged, ionic, and polar molecules, are hydrophilic. Hydrophilic means water-loving, and our sodium chloride as well as our glucose would fall into this category. On the other hand, molecules that are nonpolar, such as octane, don't interact very readily with water. Our hydrocarbon here isn't going to dissolve very well. There aren't really regions of partial negative or partial positive charge for water molecules to interact with. So instead, this kind of molecule is going to clump up and not mix well with water. It's not able to really break the cohesive forces of water, which remember are the hydrogen bonds holding water molecules together with each other. You've probably experienced this phenomenon if you've ever mixed oil and water. Substances like oil are what we call hydrophobic. Hydrophobic means water-fearing. And if you want to kind of anthropomorphize these molecules, you can think of them huddling together, scared of all the water molecules that surround them. That might not be exactly super chemically accurate, but if it helps you remember, then great. Another example of a hydrophobic molecule is actually oxygen gas, or O2. This is the oxygen that we breathe. Although a tiny bit of oxygen gas will dissolve in water, generally we need specialized oxygen carriers to move it around in the aqueous environment of our body. This is the protein hemoglobin. This protein is present in red blood cells and has the function of binding oxygen and carrying it around in the bloodstream. And hey, guess what? There's some molecules that aren't wholly hydrophobic or hydrophilic. Some of these molecules are like, hey, why not do both? For example, soap. If that oil and water clip made you think about washing the dishes, then you were already thinking along these lines. Here's an example of a common soap molecule. Let's zoom in and look at the left side of the molecule first. What do you notice? Well, I notice that this end is charged. Look, we have an ionic bond between this positively charged sodium and this negatively charged oxygen. Do you think this part of the molecule is hydrophilic or hydrophobic? Well, it's definitely hydrophilic. The charges will interact well with the partially charged water molecules. Okay, what about the other side of the molecule, which is this long tail? Remember, if these corners aren't labeled, they are carbons, and each carbon has enough hydrogens so that every carbon has 4 covalent bonds. Do you think that this part of the molecule is hydrophilic or hydrophobic? Well, each bond between carbon and hydrogen is nonpolar. The difference in electronegativity is only about 0.3. And of course, each bond between carbon and carbon is nonpolar as well because there's no difference in electronegativity. So this long part of the molecule is hydrophobic. And this structure is what makes soap work. These molecules can interact with the water on one side, but they can also interact with the hydrophobic molecules like oil that might be in that water. They surround the hydrophobic things and form what's called a micelle around them. This is a diagram showing you a cross-section of a micelle. The micelle would actually be a sphere so that the nonpolar compound, such as oil, shown here in the center, is completely surrounded by the hydrophobic tails of this molecule. The hydrophilic parts of the molecule are pointed out, interacting well with the water. So, when you wash your hands, the soap molecules sequester the hydrophobic things in these micelles, and then when you rinse your hands, the hydrophilic part of the molecule is attracted to the water running over your hands, and it washes away, taking the hydrophobic molecules with it. And all of this is going to be really important because, of course, the reactions that take place in a cell or in the human body are taking place in water. So it matters a lot how water interacts with ions, with small molecules, and with our large biomolecules that are the basis of all life on Earth.